when you hear the psychological effects of slavery, what are some of the thoughts that come to your mind when you hear somebody say, well, what is the psychological effects of slavery? Or you just in general somebody talking about
it? Absent the context, I think about a lot of things. You know what I'm saying? I think about trauma. I think about learned helplessness. I think about low self-esteem, overcompensation, trust issues, relationship development issues. I think about a lot of things when I hear that. What do you think about, Joseph? Hey, Ward.
Behavior. The first thing that comes to my mind is behavior. Overall, well, individual behavior as well as group behavior. And I think about how we treat ourselves, and I think about how we treat others. But I also I think about the Willie Lynch letter, but not in the sense of is it true or is it not true, but looking at the way behavior, African American behavior was shaped and modified throughout the millennia. And also how racism can adapt and be able to transform itself to still be present and still be dominant in our minds, in our total beings, as long as we are ignorant of what's truly happening to us. And that's the other part that I think about is how a great number of us don't really understand what has happened to us. Because you know how people are always asking, well, why are we like this and why are we like this? But not understanding, there are causes to that. We're not supposed to behave like any other group of people because what happened to us didn't happen to any other group of people. We were enslaved by some savages who brutally beat us, brutally worked us, raped us, verbally demeaned us, economically suppressed us. Any way they can terrorize us, they terrorized us. And they terrorized us for over 400 years. So, I'm always asking the question, if it took 400 to 500 years to shape our minds to the way it is now, how long will it take to undo that? Now, do I know if it'll take 400 or 500 years? I don't know. But that is the question. How long will it take to undo the mental screwing that has happened to us from all the trauma and the terror that our ancestors experienced over 400 to 500 year period?
I like that question. My view of it is, how long will it take before we can live with it and progress? Because I don't think it can be undone. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Like, we can't go back to the way we were. The experience is a part of us now. It's shaped us, it's molded us. Even if we went through some sort of magical therapy, absent of erasing the experience from us, both psychologically and genetically, it's going to be there shaping us. So how do we get to a point to where it's no longer negatively impacting our current existence and our current behaviors and our current relationships? And it's still a good question.
But that's a good addition to it, though. See, that's why we bring our minds together, because that's a great addition to what I asked. Because I think both questions are very important. How long does it take to undo it? But also, in the midst of undoing it, how long does it take to be able to live with it and progress?
Right.
Because that's the key point. Not just living with it, but living with it and progressing.
Gotta progress. Progression is the goal.
Right. And progress doesn't mean just individual progress within the white world. We mean a collective progress in the black world. With us doing
Right,
this.
right. Well, it's like the kind. I don't know if you guys saw it, but if you did not, on the show to the Giants a couple months ago, maybe longer, uh, we did a show where we talked about black progress versus white progress. And the when we're talking about progress, every time I speak about progress and I don't clarify, I'm talking about black people progressing, like doing things that allow us to acquire power and authority to manifest our own destinies, to manifest whatever we want to manifest.
Real sex, real straight up self-actualization.
Absolutely.
Section 1. Psychological legacy of slavery. Slavery was legally ended in excess of 100 years ago, but over 300 years experienced in its brutality and unnaturalness constituted a severe psychological and social shock in the minds of African Americans. This shock was so destructive to natural life processes that the current generation of African Americans, although we are 5 to 6 generations removed from the actual experience of slavery, still carry the scars of this experience in both our social and mental lives. Psychologists and sociologists have failed to attend to the persistence of problems in our mental and social lives, which clearly have roots in slavery. Only the historian has given proper attention to the shattering realities of slavery, and he has dealt with it only as descriptive of past events. Clark in 1972 observes that most social scientists would object to a discussion of slavery as a cause of contemporary behavior because it happened too long ago. Clark identifies the origin of this objection in 19th century conceptions of science articulated by the British philosophers Locke and Hume, and practiced by the scientific giant Isaac Newton. Clark observes, in the Newtonian scheme of things, a body at rest remains at rest unless acted upon by some external force. In the Newtonian scheme of things, a body at rest remains at rest unless acted upon by some external force. The behavior or movement of things was thought to be the consequence of some accident or external event. Newtonian conceptions of absolute time and space have so conditioned many of us that it is impossible for us to conceive of events that have occurred long in the past. An example is slavery, as having as much effect in determining present behavior as those events of relatively recent occurrence. But of course, we know better now, right? Clark, in this monumental piece, argues that slavery, more than any other single event, shaped the mentality of the present African American. In order to fully grasp the magnitude of our current problems, we must reopen the books on the events of slavery. Our objective should not be to cry stale tears for the past, nor to rekindle old hatreds or past injustices. Instead, we should seek to enlighten our path of today by better understanding where and how the lights we turned out yesterday. We should also understand that slavery should be viewed as a starting point for understanding the African American psyche and not as an endpoint. Therefore, the study of the African American psyche should include psychohistory, but it should not be exclusively concerned with events in the past. The list of attitudes and reactions which we have inherited from slavery is probably quite extensive. We want to identify here only some of the more blatant and currently destructive attitudes which rather clearly show their origins in their slavery situation. Hopefully, a look at this tarnished legacy will serve as a stimulus for us to rid ourselves of those slavery ideas both individually and collectively. One of the attitudes which has been passed down to us from slavery is the rather distorted African American attitude towards work. Slavery was forced labor. Kenneth Stamp in 1956 described the work of the slave occurring from day clear to first dark. The day's toil would begin just before sunrise and would end at dusk. Stamp observed, except for certain
essential chores. Sunday work was uncommon, but not unheard of if the crops required it. On Saturdays, slaves were often permitted to quit the fields at noon. They were also given holidays, most commonly at Christmas and after crops were laid by. So basically describing how hard and how long people were worked during slavery, right? Basically, however, work was a daily chore beginning in early childhood and continuing until death or total disability. The slave was forced to work under the threat of abuse or even death, but the work was not for the purpose of providing for his life's needs. Instead, he worked to produce for the slave master. He would neither profit from his labor nor enjoy the benefits of labor. A good crop did not improve his life, his family, nor his community. Instead, it improved the life, it improved the life and community of the slave master. Frederick Douglass describes the slave's work accordingly. From 12 o'clock midday till dark, the human cattle are in motion, wielding their clumsy hoes, turned on by no hope of reward, no sense of gratitude, and no love of children. Nothing save the dread and terror of the slave driver's lash. So goes one day, and so comes and goes another. Work in a natural society is looked upon with pride, both because it permits persons to express themselves and because it supplies, it supplies their survival needs. As a natural form of expression, work is not too distinguishable from play. During slavery, work was used as a punishment. The need for workers was the most identifiable cause of the African American enslavement. Work came to be despised as many punishment is despised. Work became hated as does any activity which cause suffering and brings no reward for the doer. Work become equated with slavery. Even today, the African American slang expression for job, which refers to jobs as a slave communicates this painful connection. Yep, you got to go slave today. Got to go out here and slave on these white man job. Over the course of generations, work came to be a most hated activity. Despite the fact that we are over 100 years removed from the direct slavery experience, African Americans still, to a great extent, hate work. Work is identified with punishment. Work is equated with inferiority. In 1956, Stamp also observes, masters who had their command as few as half a dozen field hands were attempted to improve their social status by withdrawing from the fields and devoting most of their time to managerial functions, but most slaves never saw their masters toiling in the fields. Consequently, slaves equated work with enslavement and freedom with avoidance of work. Work was identified as the activity of the underdog and was difficult to be viewed with pride. Work is something approached unwillingly and out of necessity only. It is also a badge of disparagement. The ability to look successful without doing any identifiable work became the image of affluence of many street hustlers and pimps, and especially with those images being put out via the media, especially of white people having affluence without doing anything. Because remember, one of the psychological effects is we want to be like white people. Many African Americans have developed a variety of habits to avoid work, such as a reliance upon gambling and other get-rich-quick schemes that are still happening today, right? Some of the difficulty that we experience in generating independent business and institutions is because of our hatred of work. It is still difficult to view the long-term reward of sustained work as being adequate to erase the stigma of such toil. It is much easier to work, often considerably harder, for someone else and get a predictable periodic salary and a work schedule which lets one create an illusion of leisure. Every Friday evening until Sunday becomes Emancipation Day all over again. And welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, and I am beginning my reading of Dr. Naeem Akbar's book, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. This is the book that we chose, right? Because we just got through doing our reading of Dr. Carter G. Woodson's amazing book, The Miseducation of the Negro. And the Miseducation of the Negro is to get your copy. The link is in the description to get your copy. If you have not got your copy yet, you tripping. Great book. If you haven't seen the videos, go back and watch the videos. A lot of great information was given. But we ended this book and I gave 4 choices. The 4 choices were, of course, breaking the chains of psychological slavery, $40 million slaves, up from slavery in the new Jim Crow, and with 45% of the votes, breaking the chains of psychological slavery won, and the new Jim Crow came in second with 29% of the votes, and $40 million slaves and up from slavery both tied for third, fourth place with 13% of the votes. But here we are breaking down. We're gonna have some fun breaking down this book. I ain't gonna lie, I'm kind of glad this book won. I did want to read this book, so I ain't gonna lie. So here we are breaking down and doing our review of Dr. Naeem Akbar's Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. And you see, we're starting off with the psychological legacy of slavery. And I started with a clip from an old interview old podcast that I found me and Pat did in 2021, who were actually talking about this very topic, the psychological legacy of slavery. And we were talking about the total effects that slavery had in shaping how we behave as human beings today. And that is exactly what we're getting into with within the first parts of this book. How one's behavior can be shaped by their experiences and their environment and those who have power and control over their lives. Behavior can be shaped. Social engineering is real. And that's what we're getting into, because we're learning how to break those chains, how to rewire ourselves, how to reprogram ourselves from that Negro mindset back to a foundational Black American or an African or Caribbean mindset, whatever mindset that we need to have wherever we are. But it's a mindset that is conducive and productive and constructive for us. So that's what we're getting into today. So Section 1, Psychological Legacy of Slavery. Of course, you know I'm going to give you my core thesis, my key points. These are my key points. What is psychological slavery? Slavery as a system of psychological conditioning, intergenerational trauma, and inherited behavior. Internalized inferiority, fragmentation of the Black psyche, damage to the family and community structures, the mask of adjustment, why psychological slavery is hard to recognize, the first step to breaking the chains. And so these are things that we are going to be getting into today in this video. And I'm kind of excited because, like I said, this is a great book that I read in college, and I was looking to get back into it. So the core thesis of Section 1. Let's get into it. The core thesis, right? What before that, before I get into the core thesis, hold on. Before I get into the core thesis, make sure you hit that like button, comment, subscribe, and share. I should have said that earlier, but hit that like button, comment, subscribe, and share. You can hit that hype button. You can hit the super like button. All those things to support this channel, to help this channel grow. Remember, I am being shadow banned like a mug, but we could break through the shadow banning by you just coming to the channel every day at 1 o'clock and watching the videos that I drop, especially if you like these book readings and these book reviews. And before I go any further, let me make sure I show you my commercial. Oh, I told y'all I was gonna get my merch shop up and running, so I've got it. So I want to show y'all my merch shop. So this is it. So I got some hats. So I got my own The Shoulders of Giants hats available for order. I have shirts. This is supposed to be like a canvas, some kind of shirt, jersey shirt. I don't know why they got that design, but it's a jersey shirt. Somebody wanted. Got hoodies, regular shirts, heavy, what they call it, the heavy tee, tees for men's, unisex tees for women. Everything. I got a mug. I gotta get this mug too. But this is the merch that I have available. See, I got my mug, I have my hats, and I have my apparel available. And all of that is, the links and stuff are below and connected to the video. So I got my merch shop up and running. Been working on that for a minute in the background to get my merch shop up and running. So I got it up and running. So if you want to support the channel, get you some merch, it's all available. Links below and links attached to the video. Yes. And remember, link to my website is scrolling below, so you can get your copies of my books, On the Shoulders of Giants, volumes 1 through 4. I'm covering the sung and unsung heroes of the African diaspora in North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. And I'm actually working on volume 5, Europe. I'm working on Europe, and I have a children's book that is done, that is being worked on, being illustrated. So I got some stuff coming. I got some more stuff coming. I'm gonna be hitting y'all in the head with some stuff. So let's get into the core thesis of section 1 of Psychological Legacy of Slavery. Dr. Naim Akbar, he argues that slavery did not end psychologically when it ended legally. While chains were removed from Black bodies, mental chains remained because there was a conditioning that was put in place, shaping identity, behavior, self-perception, and relationships across generations. These internalized patterns function as psychological residue passed down culturally, socially, and emotionally. And so that leads us to our first key point. The first key point is, what is psychological slavery? Psychological slavery refers to internalized oppression. Internalized oppression. They teach us how to internalize all the negativity that they taught us about ourselves. This adaptation of beliefs, values, and behaviors that serve the interests of the oppressor rather than the oppressed. That Negro mindset. Remember, America's greatest invention was the nigger, because the nigger is a self-destructive, self-debasing individual. They will destroy themselves and their communities and everything around them, especially to have white love. So this behavior, this psychological slavery, causes Black people to doubt their worth and intelligence, seek validation from dominant white society, distrust themselves and one another. Akbar emphasizes that mental conditioning is more effective than physical change because it requires no external force to maintain. And remember, even Dr. Runoko Rashidi said, if white supremacy was to end today, Black people will continue the system because of how we were programmed. All right, so let's get back into the reading. This will be page 6. I'm at the top of page 6, continuing my reading and jumping back into the book. And remember to hit that like button, comment, subscribe, and share to this channel. There are some African Americans who become over-dependent on welfare as a way of life because of this work phobia. Remember, we're talking about starting the section out talking about how Black people were acculturated to working. We were forced to be workers. So our view of work today is distorted. It's not the same as other people because of how we were acculturated to working here in America, here in the United States. We were forced to be workers. Often considerable energy is put into schemes to avoid work because real work is so distasteful. This too can be related to the historical root of associating work with slavery. Certainly, the historical origin of the hatred of work does not completely explain the African Americans' orientation to work. Equally as relevant is the vast shortage of jobs and the many obstacles to receiving the same benefits from work as to other members of the society. Work is still geared toward community building for others and not for African Americans. In addition, the society itself has developed such a leisure orientation that work has come to be something to be despised by all members of society. And we can see that today with everybody just want to find the easiest path to success and wealth, right? It is important, however, for African Americans to know that many of our attitudes toward work are a result of our slavery experiences. The negative experiences associated with work continue to function as unconscious influences on us that makes us respond in ways which may be contrary to our conscious intention. Awareness of these influences and their sources begin to free us from their effects. Our slang, our songs, our jokes, our attitudes, transmitted from one generation to the next, preserve these reactions as if they were acquired yesterday. And remember, until you understand where it comes from, you think you're the first ones to do it. The slave was permitted to own nothing or very little. Certainly, property was the finer material objects, such as clothes, jewelry, etc., were reserved for the slave master. Douglas in 1970 again observes, the yearly allowance of clothing for the slaves on this plantation consisted of two linen shirts, such linen as the coarsest crash towels are made of, one pair of trousers, and a jacket of woolen, most slavishly put together for winter, one pair of yarn stockings, one pair of shoes of the coarsest description. The slave's entire apparel could not have cost more than $8 per year. The allowance of food and clothing for little children was committed to their mothers or the older slave women having care of them. Children who were unable to work in the fields had neither shoes, stockings, jackets, nor trousers given them. Their clothing consisted of two coarse two linen shirts already described per year. And when these failed them, they often did, they went naked until the next allowance day. That's crazy, right? Imagine what effect that has on your psyche as a child. You have to go around naked, especially in the cold and all those different things. The slave master's fine house, beautiful landscaping, exquisite clothes, and objects were associated with his power and status. So think about how we want to have these status symbols today. All the fancy cars, the fancy clothes, the things with all the white people's names and labels on them. Because if you don't have them, then you haven't made it. In the same way that the slave looked upon his master with hatred and resentment, he also resented and envied the master's possessions because those possessions were associated with freedom and power to direct one's life, family, and community. African Americans have the slavery influence of mixed attitudes toward material objects and property. On the one hand, those objects are still associated with the master and his powers. Therefore, there is a tendency to resent property and to take a secret or unconscious delight in attacking it, right? Certainly, some of our tendencies towards vandalism and abuse of property have their origin in these experiences with property. Property is still viewed as belonging to the master and not to the slave. This finds additional expression when the African American is thrown into public housing and rented properties, which are in fact still owned by the descendants of slave masters. Vandalism is unconsciously gratifying in that it acts out the long present resentment of the master's property. Given the persisting dependence on the master, and it's safer to be neglectful of its property than overly hostile towards him. I'm going to read that again. Given the persisting dependence on the master, it is safer to be neglectful to his property than overly hostile towards him, because we have learned to not bite the hand that feeds us. On the other hand, slavery produced an unnatural attraction to material objects. The cast-off hat or dress passed down from the big house to the cabin became a symbol of pride and status. By wearing Master's old hat or Mrs. old dress, one could play at being Master or Mrs. for a few fanciful moments. It's so good to be fancy like Master and Mrs., right? An illustration of this idea dating back to slavery experiences also comes from Stamp. The elegantly dressed slaves who promenaded the streets of southern towns and cities on Sundays, the men in fine linen and bright waistcoats, the women in full petticoats and silk gowns were usually the domestic servants of wealthy planters and townspeople. Butlers, coachmen, maids, and valets had to uphold the prestige of their white families. These material objects or dreads of property became equated in the African American thinking with the full power of freedom and self-determination which the master enjoyed. We can observe a similar pattern in our developing children who play at being mama and daddy by putting on objects of their clothing or other objects associated with them. The legacy of such experience with property and materials has made these objects powerfully influential in the lives of many African Americans. Large sums of money are thrown away yearly on expensive, flashy clothes and cars. Uncomfortable, impractical, and showy items of furniture drain our budgets and fail to satisfy our longings because of this persistent wish to look like the slave master. Many of our judgments about our people and their worth are disproportionately determined by what those people own or wear. We spend great energy and wealth acquiring those objects associated with power rather than real human, social, political, and economic power. There is a frequent tendency to confuse tokens of power with genuine power based upon the slavery experience. It is not unusual for concerned efforts to attain real political and economic power to be prematurely aborted by a strategic disposition of tokens. Excuse me. Let me read that again. It is not unusual for concerned efforts to obtain real political and economic power to be prematurely aborted by a strategic disposition of tokens. Realistically assertive efforts to alter social structures to equitably accommodate America's former slaves have frequently been terminated by offering limited material goods to the major strategists, and the movement dies. Hey man, cherry pick them leaders and give them the crumbs. The major thinkers and scholars, potentially our most powerful agents of change in African American communities, are often neutralized by a pittance of material goods. This socially destructive phenomena has its roots in the slavery experience. Too often, the leaders in our communities have equated a small trinket of material gain with having arrived. That leadership is soon lost to the African American community. It is a recurrence of the old image of wearing Mouser's discarded hat and thinking that now you are the Mouser. It is important that we caution the reader in considering these ideas, that we remember these factors are only one aspect of what determines our behavior. The destructiveness and violence in the American society present mentally fosters vandalism. The materialism which has overrun the Western mind certainly has had its effect on the African American mind. We simply want to be aware of the predispositions which operate from within us, from our past, which may influence us in ways we do not realize. And so let me get back to my second key point. So the second key point is slavery as a system of psychological conditioning. Psychological conditioning was necessary, right? Akbar explains that slavery was not just an economic system, but a psychological training program designed to, one, destroy African identity. You are no longer connected to the continent of Africa or the culture that you came from. Two, break communal bonds, mixing people all up. Three, replace African worldviews with European worldviews. And we talked about that. We talked about having European frameworks rather than African or foundational Black American frameworks, which we have to invent and construct. Condition, obedience, dependency, and inferiority was beat into us, right? Key strategies used during slavery was renaming Africans so you can help them lose their identity. Prohibiting African language, religion, and culture to be practiced. Rewarding submission and punishing independence, meritorious manumission, and creating a fear as a primary control mechanism. So if you try to continue to practice who you truly are and not assimilate and conform to this new American structure, to this new psychological program that I'm giving you, you will be punished or you will be taken off this earth. Third key point is intergenerational trauma and inherited behavior. Akbar explains that trauma does not disappear. It is transmitted across generations. And we learned about that through epigenetics. Even without direct experience of slavery, descendants inherit coping mechanisms, defensive behaviors, and survival psychology because we exist in survival units. These behaviors may have once been adaptive, but are now maladaptive in a post-slavery context. And even with them being adaptive, they were not healthy. Examples is hypervigilance, and Dr. Joy DeGruy talked about that. You know, we want to put on our cape and save everybody except ourselves. Emotional suppression. We're going to suppress, especially around white people. Around massa, suppress how we really feel. Distrust of authority and self. We definitely distrust Black authority. And we distrust ourselves. And conflict avoidance or explosive anger. Conflict avoidance with white people and explosive anger toward ourselves and other Black people, because we understand that we should not bite the hand that we feed. Should not bite the hand that feed us. So back to the reading. Page 9. Probably one of the most destructive influences which has grown out of slavery is the disrespect of African-American leadership. The allegory is seen throughout nature that the most certain way to destroy life is to cut off the head. From the turkey to the cow to the human being, the most immediate way to bring death to the body is to remove its head. This is especially true as a social principle. One of the things that was systematically done during slavery was the elimination of control of any emerging head or leader. Slave narratives and historical accounts are full of descriptions of atrocities brought against anyone who exemplified real leadership capabilities. The slaveholders realized that their power and control over the slaves was dependent upon the absence of any indigenous leadership among the slaves. Any slave who began to emerge as a natural lead, that is, one oriented toward survival of the whole body, was identified early and was either eliminated, isolated, killed, or ridiculed. In his or her place was put a leader who had been carefully picked, trained, tested to stand only for the master's welfare. In other words, unnatural heads were attached to the slave communities. They furthered the cause of the master and frustrated the cause of the slave. The slaves were taught to view with suspicion natural leaders who emerged from among themselves. Such heads were identified as uppity or arrogant and were branded as the kind of troublemakers who were destined to bring trouble to the entire slave community because you gonna have them white people mad at us. This idea was reinforced by public punishment of such indigenous leadership and any of his or her associates or sympathizers. The entire slave community was often required to carry an extra burden or be deprived of some small privilege, primarily because of these uppity slaves. You radicals. Such practices rather firmly entrenched the oppression to natural leaders. They were often isolated by their own community and were usually the victims of fellow slaves, snitches who reported to the master that someone was brewing trouble. The snitches, having demonstrated their loyalty to the master, were usually promoted to the position of slave leader, and another grafted leader was born. With the slave body and master's head, meritorious manumission. The slave community was encouraged to view the great power given to the master-trained leader as an indication of his superior worth as a leader. The master-trained leader was rewarded, praised, and given privileges as an inducement for the slaves to follow his manufactured leadership. The long generations of being conditioned to reject natural and strong leadership had not only stifled the development of such leaders, but African Americans still respond by rejecting such leaders. Even outstanding leaders, such as Dr. Martin Luther King, were rejected or denied support by African American educated or professional classes of people in our communities. A caveat though, Dr. Martin Luther King actually was one of those appointed and placed leaders, because Dr. Vernon Johns was the indigenous leader that was replaced with Dr. Martin Luther King. I want to make sure we understood that Dr. Vernon Johns was the indigenous leader who was replaced by the appointed leader, Dr. Martin Luther King. But nevertheless, Dr. King was condemned in the early days of his civil rights campaigns as a troublemaker. Dr. King and many of the young ministers who spearheaded the civil rights movement had to leave their denominational convention and from another one to escape the criticism of their traditional colleagues who saw their social activism as troublesome because it was troublesome to white people. Only after receiving recognition as a leader, powerful leaders who emerged from the ranks of the uneducated, such as Elijah Muhammad, never received wide acceptance among the educated classes of former slaves, despite the fact that he offered the most powerful economic and self-help program of that time. Contemporary Negro history accounts devote extensive coverage to Muhammad's trainees, such as Malcolm X Shabazz, while mentioning the natural lead who was his teacher only in passing. The same pattern of rejecting indigenous leadership showed its head in 1995, the Million Man March, when many traditional religious and political leaders rejected the leadership of Minister Louis Farrakhan because he wasn't approved by the white establishment. An important sign that this mentality is changing was the presence of over 1 million people at the march, despite white disapproval of its indigenous leadership. Such rejection of strong African-American leadership is as conditioned in us as is our fear and hatred of a burning cross. It is important to realize that such efforts to undermine effective African-American leadership is still an ongoing part in the current society. The press, for example, fails to mention many of the outstanding accomplishments of indigenous African-American leadership. On the other hand, the least important statement from a master appointed leader gains front page coverage. The other side of this issue of grafted leaders is that a realistically based suspicion of African-American leadership grew in our communities. Forced to reject natural leadership in opposition to our natural survival instincts and to accept oppressor appointed leadership compelled our communities to essentially suspect all leadership, even though we accept the appointed leadership. We really are suspicious about indigenous Black leadership. This suspicion is manifested in a rather pervasive disrespect for Black leaders unless they come equipped with a supply of token or mystical power. The token power usually comes in the form of a limousine, some ostentatious clothing, and some rather impressive jewelry. The mystical power requires identifying one's leadership as having some kind of divine legitimization. The leaders often gain considerable followings of an intensely emotional form. The other leaders who gain strong support are projected by the masters, media, and press, and are often chosen from uninformed athletes, politically naive preachers, or even entertainers. It's still happening today. That's why I'm laughing, because it's still happening. It hasn't changed. The leadership of such persons seldom extends beyond their faddish or transitory stardom. Meanwhile, all other forms of small-scale and large-scale leaders, indigenous and otherwise, are destroyed by suspicion and disrespect and are never, ever supported by the masses. As a people, African Americans must begin to recognize the disposition which has been conditioned in us to reject natural, effective leadership. If we understand that we have been programmed through our history to reject our natural heads, we may begin to become more conscious of recognizing true leaders. It can be easily demonstrated that the persistent distrust and limited support given to African American leaders has its origin in the many appropriate heads which have been affixed to our bodies historically. One is the clown. Another popular character which has its origin in slavery is the African American clown, right? One of the primary forms of remaining in favor with the slave master by the slave was to provide entertainment for the master and his household. It is easy to observe the main exalts of his superiority over lower animals by teaching them to do tricks and to be entertained by those tricks. In much the same way, the slave owner prided himself in his superiority by being entertained by the slave. Writers have long pointed to the jester, the clown, or the fool as the inferior one who was responsible for making his superior laugh. Using a person for your clown has always been one of the major ways to assert your dominance over a person. Mockery is one of the more sophisticated forms of humiliation. Great favors of leniency and special rewards were given to the clowning slave. He enjoyed a special status above other slaves because he kept his masters entertained. Even the arts, music, and dance, which had originally been used for cultural expression and community recreation, became devices which were used by the slave to protect himself from the master's anger. Fiddler in the TV drama Roots was a colorful example of this manipulative function of the clown. Clowning and buffoonery became one of the primary ways that the violent and abusive slave master could be controlled and manipulated. A laughing or a satisfied master was less likely to be a violent master. Frederick Douglass observes this in his autobiography. In all the songs of the slaves, there was ever some expression in praise of the great house farm, something which would flatter the pride of the owner and possibly draw a favorable glance from him. I am going away to the great house farm. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. My old master is a good old master. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. This they would sing with other words of their own improvisation jargon to others, but full of meaning to themselves. The problem with this pattern was with others we have discussed is that this kind of response has long outlived its real usefulness. What began as a survival tactic under highly unnatural living conditions has become a crippling part of the psychology of a people seeking to restore life and community to themselves. An overwhelming number of popular media presentations involve African American clowns. Comedy is valuable unless it is done to the exclusion of aspects of other facets of people's lives. The clear underrepresentation of serious aspects of African American life in the popular media suggests that even the former slaves prefer to laugh about themselves rather than improve themselves. The buffoon Martin Lawrence in the 1990s and the bug-eyed JJ on the program Good Times in the 1970s are updates of the 1940s and 50s Stepin Fetchit and Mantan Moreland. These clowns were updates to the slavery buffoon who mastered being funny to survive. This is not to degrade obvious talent of these master showmen, but to identify a force which has exalted the clown while degrading or ignoring the scientist or other artistic genius among African Americans. Entertainers and athletes are the popular heroes of the African American community, and they still are today. Physical prowess or a common exploit are the only characteristics Black heroes are permitted to express. Intellectual acuity, prophetic vision, more integrity, technological know-how, managerial efficiency, and characteristics seldom, if ever, portrayed conscientiously. The slave images of power persist. African American children, as a consequence, strive to throw balls or croon on microphones rather than seeking to explore the universe, discover cures for infectious diseases, or discovers ways to feed starving masses in Africa or India. Such a preoccupation with impotent images Such a preoccupation with impotent images was a device to keep the slave's aspiration in check. These ball players and singers are still rewarded with airtime and salaries unimaginable, while Black scientists and scholars are seldom shown and poorly paid. The consequence is that African American young people seek greater possibility on the court, field, or stage than they can imagine for the corporate suite, laboratory, surgery theater, or computer lab. The current slave mentality still inhibits aspiration to be anything more than a clown. The clear exception is Dr. Bill Cosby, who used the clown's role only as a tool in the educational agenda from his mind and that of others who were committed to the advancement of African American life. An even more common example of the modern slave clown is the person who feels the necessity to be a daily clown in his interactions with Caucasians. Many people have observed or experienced the African American member of an interracial team serving as the entertainer over lunch or at the party. Somehow, the token African American always manages to be the funniest guy. It becomes an obsession on the part of the minority member to maintain favor with his colleagues by keeping them laughing. He often finds himself being targeted. Come on, Sam, tell us a joke. Come on. So another old pattern with its roots in slavery continues to bring rewards to the on excuse me. So another old pattern with its roots in slavery continues to bring rewards on the modern stage. Human beings are unable to be about the serious business of living and building societies if they feel compelled to always clown or entertain others. People do not take you seriously if you do not take yourself seriously. A sense of humor brings necessary balance to an organized life, but a life of humor blinds one to life. All right, let's get to some more of these key points. I think this is our third key point. Our fourth key point, rather. Internalized inferiority is our fourth key point. One of the most damaging legacies of slavery is the belief, often unconscious, that white is superior, black is inferior, and European norms define intelligence, beauty, and success. I'm going to say that again. One of the most damaging legacies of slavery is the belief, often unconscious, that white is superior, black is inferior, and European norms define intelligence, beauty, and success. Akbar explains that this manifests as colorism within the African American community, or within the foundational black community within us, self-hatred, over-identification with white standards, and devaluation of African-centered thinking and culture. Because, hey, man, we ain't think about like them old extra black people, man. We don't get down with that. We don't like slavery and racism and all this stuff, but we ain't trying to be like, oh, you back to Africa people, right? Fragmentation of the black psyche is our next key point. Slavery disrupted African holistic identity, which emphasized balance between mind, body, spirit, and community. We have been all blended up. Now we think and operate like white folk, right? Western psychology imposed during and after slavery separates and fragments the individual. Remember Yurugu. Yurugu, we learned, is the white man who is incomplete because he totally separated himself from nature. He disconnected himself from nature, and his connection is to the material thing, while our connection is to the natural. His connection is to the material. That's why they value the material. And in programming us, we now value the material over the natural. Akbar critiques Western psychology for ignoring spirituality, right? But that's who they are. And we have to understand that that's who they are. That's how they get down, right? Treating black pathology without addressing historical trauma, that's what they do. And labeling survival responses as disorders. Once again, that's what they do. Let me get to another key point. Another key point is damage to family and community structures. That's what the legacy of psychological slavery did. It left damage to family and community structures, right? Slavery intentionally weakened black family bonds. It was meant to weaken every aspect of our lives, all 9 areas. Education, entertainment, what it is. Education, entertainment, economics, labor, law, politics, war, sex, and religion. All 9 areas of human activity, especially for us, were to be damaged and ruined. So it intentionally weakened black family bonds, forced separation of parents and children, undermining black male authority, or eliminating black male authority in the black male presence, encouraging dependency on the master. Akbar argues these disruptions created role confusion, gender antagonism, and distrust within the community. He was on point. These issues persist because the psychological damage was never healed. It was never healed. All right, let's pick up on page 14. Let us consider another one of the most destructive characteristics from slavery. The characteristics is a sense of inferiority as African American people. This characteristic has been discussed by psychologists more than any other. It has been used as an explanation from nearly every aspect of African American behavior. The self-hatred or low self-esteem of African American people has certainly been outworked, but is worthy of our consideration in this discussion. The shrewd slave makers were fully aware that people who still respected themselves as human beings would resist to the death the dehumanizing process of slavery. Therefore, a systematic process of creating a sense of inferiority in the proud African was necessary in order to maintain them as slaves. This was done by humiliating and dehumanizing acts such as public beatings, parading them on slave blocks, unclothing and inspecting them as though they were cattle or horses. They were forbidden to communicate with other slaves, which would have been a basis of maintaining self-respect. Many historians and slave narratives report how young children were separated from their mothers because the mother's love might cultivate some self-respect in the child. Cleanliness and personal effectiveness are fairly essential in the maintenance of self-respect. The slaves were kept filthy, and the very nature of physical restraints over long periods of time began to develop in the people a sense of helplessness. And we know white people don't like to bathe, so the loss of the ability to even clean one's body and to shield oneself from a blow began to teach the slaves that they should have no self-respect. These things combined with the insults, the loss of cultural traditions, rituals, family life, religion, and even names served to cement the loss of self-respect. As the slave master exalted himself and enforced respect on himself, he was increasingly viewed as superior to the slaves. The superiority was based on the utter dehumanization of the Africans. The slave was forced to bow and bend to the slave owner and to treat him as God. With the image of a Caucasian man, even as God, and with all kinds of images of Africans as dirty and only half human, it was inevitable that a sense of inferiority would grow into the African American personality. Carter G. Woodson, which we just got through reading, observed over a half century ago, to handicap a student for life by teaching him that his black face is a curse, that his struggle to change his condition is hopeless. It's the worst kind of lynching. It kills one's aspirations and dooms him to vagabondage and crime. This sense of inferiority still affects us in many ways. Our inability to respect African American leadership, our persistent and futile efforts to look like and act like Caucasian people is based upon the sense of inferiority. The persistent tendency to think of dark skin as unattractive, kinky hair as bad hair, and African features as less appealing than Caucasian features come from the sense of inferiority. Our lack of respect for African American experience, our lack of respect for African American expertise and the irresponsibility of many African American experts come from this sense of inferiority. The disastrously high black on black homicide rate in this rate is in many ways indicative of fundamental disrespect for black life growing out of this same sense of inferiority. It is a simple fact that people who love themselves seek to preserve their lives, not destroy them. The fact that we remain as consumers and laborers rather than manufacturers, planners, and managers has a lot to do with the sense of inferiority. The continued portrayal of the media of African Americans as clowns, servants, crooks, and impotents maintain this sense of inferiority. The limited number of powerful and dignified images of African Americans in the media and the community as a whole reduces our sense of self-respect. This is a continuation of the slavery patterns. Only those persons who look like, act like, and thought like the frame of reference of the master were completely acceptable. Those earning such acceptance were projected as more superior to those who looked like, acted like, and thought in the frame of reference of African self-affirmation. We can revise the destructive effects of slavery by looking to strengths in our past and beginning to make plans for our future. If we begin to direct our children's attention to strong images like themselves, they will grow into self-respect. We must honor and exalt our own heroes, and those heroes must be people who have done the most to dignify us as a people. I'm going to say that again. We must honor and exalt our own heroes, and those heroes must be people who have done the most to dignify us as a people. We must seek to overcome the plantation ghost by identifying the forces which lead to enslavement and self-abasement. We must definitely avoid the psychologically destructive representation of God in Caucasian form discussed in a later chapter. We must build and maintain strong, clean, and safe communities. The ability to influence our environments in some small way is the first step towards building and restoring our self-respect. And I'm going to stop my reading right there for the sake of time and get back to these key points and finish up these key points. So this next key point right here is the mask of adjustment, right? Dr. Akbar introduces the idea that many Black people learn to perform survival roles. The good Negro, the entertainer, the compliant worker, the good Negro, the entertainer, and the compliant worker. These masks help individuals navigate white-dominated spaces, but come at the cost of authenticity, of being authentic. I'm messing my word, authenticity. How am I messing these words up? I'm tripping. The mask help individuals navigate white-dominated spaces, but come at the cost of authenticity and self-respect. This word beating me up today. Authenticity and self-respect is what is often traded. Why psychological slavery is hard to recognize? Because it is normalized. It has been normalized in our everyday patterns, in our everyday life. Because it masquerades as just the way things are. It masquerades as culture. It masquerades as personality. Akbar stresses that unconscious enslavement is the most dangerous form. So one of the first steps of breaking the chains, though, and Dr. Akbar is making it clear that freedom begins with awareness. What we just got through reading. Freedom begins with awareness. Healing requires naming the damage, being honest and truthful about what's happening and what has happened, understanding its origins, reclaiming African-centered or foundational Black-centered identity and values. Without psychological liberation, political, economic, and social freedom will always be incomplete. If they have your mind, nothing else matters. You cannot free a people who have been trained to think like slaves. You cannot free a people who have been trained to think like slaves. You cannot free a people who have been trained to think like slaves. And remember, one of the last things I do want to tell you in the reading of this chapter or this section is Dr. Naim Akbar is not saying that Black people are broken. We are damaged, but we're not broken. We are conditioned. But like all conditions, we can be deconditioned. It can be changed. We can be reprogrammed. We have to be intentional about it. But once again, we must understand what happened to us by naming the damage, understanding its origins, and reclaiming our identity and values. Without psychological liberation, political, economic, and social freedom will always be incomplete. And that's going to conclude my reading of this first section of Dr. Naim Akbar's book, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. So I'm going to end there, and that is, where did I stop? So I stopped on page 15. So we're going to pick up next week. Next week, we're going to pick up on page 16. Page 16 is where we're picking up because we want to get through the whole section. So we're going to pick up on page 16 next week. And it goes from next week, we're going to go from 16 to, it goes from 16 to 25. So next week, we're picking up on page 16 and going from page 16 to page 25 because we want to get through the whole section and read everything. But, you know, I don't want to bore you, so we ain't going to be here all day, but do want to give you chunks of it and break it down the right way. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for choosing this book, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. I think it's a great addition to the Miseducation of the Negro, but all the other books are as well. So let's continue reading, growing our minds, and please continue supporting this channel. Hit that like button, comment, subscribe, share, and I'll see y'all next Monday with the continuing of Section 1, Psychological Legacy of Slavery. Peace out.